Welcome, my friends, to another episode of Friday Night Frights, Season 9, Episode 2. And today we are going to be reading from the ghost stories of R. James, not Mr. James as I had thought last week. This was book gifted to me by viewer and good friend RJ. He's book guy and he knows books very well, and this is one of his favorite authors. And he says, "Hey Vampire, you read some of his works during your Christmas show, and I like his story, so I sent you a book, and could you read some during Friday Night Frights?" And I said, "Sure, RJ, we could do that." So here we go. And then we could throw some more of Alvin Schwartz's work in there, scary stories told in the dark too, because those are fun, spooky stories as well. Okay, here we go. This one is called Lost Hearts. A lost heart. I hope they found it, because you can't go very long without your heart. Okay. It was, as far as I can ascertain, in September of that year, in 1811, that a post-chaise drew up before the door at Aswarby Hall, in the heart of Lincolnshire. The little boy, who was only a passenger in the chaise, who had jumped out as soon as it had stopped, looked about him with the keenest curiosity during the short interval that elapsed between the ringing of the bell and opening of the door. He saw a tall, square red brick house built in the reign of Anne, referring to Queen Anne. A stone pillar porch had been added in the pure classical style of 1790. The windows of the house were many, tall and narrow, with small panes and thick white woodwork. A pediment pierced with a round window crowned the front. There were wings to the right and left, connected by curious glazed galleries supported by colonnades with central block. It reminds me of home. These wings plainly contained the stables and offices of the houses. Each were surrounded by ornamental cupola with gilded vane. An evening light shone on the building, making the window panes glow like so many fires. Away from the hall, in front of the stretched plank park studded with oaks and fringed with firs, which stood out against the sky. The clock in the church tower, buried in the trees on the edge of the park, only its golden feathered clock catch the light, was striking 6, and the sound came gently beating down the wind, and it was altogether a pleasant impression, strong tinged with a sort of melancholy appropriate to an evening in, turn page, early autumn. And it was conveyed in the mind of the boy who was standing on the porch waiting for the door to open to him. And he had just come from Woodwickshire. 6 months ago had lifted him where he had been left an orphan. Now, owing to the gentleman who unexpected offer, his elderly cousins, Mrs. Abney, had come to live in Ashby. The offer was unexpected because all he knew anything of Mr. Abney looked upon him as somewhat austere recluse, in whose steady-going household the advent of a small boy would import a new and, it seemed, incordious element. Oh boy, it is hot out here in Arizona, pardon me. The truth is that the very little was known of Mr. Abney's pursuits or temper. The professor of Greek in Cambridge had been heard to say that no one knew more of religious beliefs in the later pagans than did the owner of Aswarby. Certainly his library contained all and the then of Mithras and Neoplatonius. Well, it's kind of a fang twister for me. Pardon me, the accent gotten in the way. In the marble paved hall stood a group of Mithras slaying a bull, which had been imported from the Laviat, a great expense to the owner. It's kind of as a statue of this guy killing a bull. That's pretty cool. I like the statue killing bull guy. I like that. It had been contributed as a description into the Gentleman's Magazine, and he had written a remark on a series of articles in a critical museum on the superstitions of the Romans of the Lower Empire. And he had taken upon it in fine as a man who wrapped up in his books, and it was a matter of great surprise among his neighbors, and he had shown even have heard of the orphan cousin Stephen Elliott, Stephen Elliott, much more than he should have volunteered to make him an inmate of Aswarby Hall. I wonder if this was a brazen bull. You know, the bull that was hollowed out, and you would stick a prisoner in it and light the fire underneath and heat the guy up. Well, different kind of bull, I'm assuming. Oh, whatever may have been expected by his neighbors, it was certain that Mr. Abney, the tall and thin Astrady, seemed to incline to give his young cousin a kindly reception, and maintain the front door was open, and he darted out his study, rubbing his hands with delight. "How are you, my boy? How are you? How old are you?" he said. "That is, you are not too much tired, I hope, by your journey to eat your supper?" "No, thank you, sir," said Master Elliot. "I'm pretty well." "That's good, lad, Mr. Abney," said Mr. Abney. "Now, how old are you, my boy?" It seemed a little odd that he should have asked that question twice in the first 2 minutes of their acquaintance. That is a little bit strange, don't you think? Isn't it strange? Isn't that a song from the 70s? 1970s, not from 1770s or 1670s, from Vampir's time. I'm 12 years old. Next birthday, sir, said Stephen. And when is your birthday, my dear boy? 11th of September, eh? That's well. That's very well. Nearly a year since, isn't it? One moment, please. I like to get these things down in my book. Sure, it's 12, certain. Yes, quite sure, sir. Well. Take him to Mrs. Bunch's room, Parks, and let him have his tea, supper, whatever it is. Yes, sir. Yes, sir, answered the staid Mrs. Parks, and said Mr. Parks, and conducted Stephen to the lower regions. Mrs. Bunch was the most comfortable human person who Stephen had as yet met in Aswarby. She made him completely at home. They were great friends in a quarter of an hour, and great friends they remained. Mrs. Bunch had been born in the neighborhood some 50 years before the date of Stephen's arrival, and her residence at the Hall was 20 years standing. Consequently, everyone knew the ins and outs of the house in that district. Mrs. Bunch knew them, and she was by no means disinclined to communicate her information. Certainly there were plenty of things about the Hall and the Hall gardens which Stephen, who was an adventurous, inquiring turn, was anxious to have explained to him. Who built the temple at the end of the Laurel Walk? Who was the old man whose picture hung in the staircase sitting at the table with the skull under his hand? Oh, that's my kind of picture, don't you think? And there were many similar points were clear upon the resources of Mrs. Bunch's powerful intellect, and there were others of which were explanations furnished were less satisfactory. One November evening, Stephen was stirring by the fire in the house, keeping warm, reflecting on his surroundings. Is Mr. Abney a good man? And will he go to heaven? He suddenly asked, and that peculiar confidence which a child possesses, and the ability of the elders to settle these questions, the decision of which is believed to be reserved for those other tribunals. Good? Bless the child, said Mrs. Bunch. Master, as kind a soul as ever I see. Didn't I ever tell you of the little boy as he took in and out of the street, as you may say, the 7 years back, and the little girl, these 2 years after when I first came here? No, do tell all about them, Mrs. Bunch. Now, this minute. Oh, demanding little boy, isn't he? Well, said Mrs. Bunch, the little girl I didn't seem to recollect so much about. I know Master brought her here with him before his walk one day, and gave orders to Mrs. Ellis, who was a housekeeper then, as she should lost my place as she should she should took good care of her, and the poor child hadn't no one belonging to her. She told me that her own self, and here she lived with us a matter of 2 or 3 weeks, as it might be, and then whether she were somewhere, whether she were, some think, a gypsy in her blood or not. But one morning she out of her own bed afterwards. This woman talks kind of goofy, or my dyslexia is kicking in. Any of us had opened our eyes, neither track nor trace of her have I ever seen on since. Master was wonderful. Master was wonderful, put about, and had all the ponds dragged, but it was my belief that she had away by them gypsies, for they were singing around the house for as much as an hour the night she went. In Parks he declared, as he heard them a-calling in the woods that afternoon, "Dear, dear, a hod child," he said, "so silent in her ways and all, but I was wonderful taken up with her, so domestic she was, surprisingly." "And what about the boy, said Stephen. "Ah, that poor boy," sighed Mrs. Bunch. "He were a foreigner, Jevony, he called himself, and he came a tweaking his urdy-gurdy around about the drive one winter day. Master 'ad him in the middle." Okay, she does speak kind of weird. "That minute, and asked about where he come from, and how old he was, and how he made his way, and were his relatives. And he asked all his Boy, this lady does speak weird. So basically, he's asking a bunch of questions, like he asked the little boy. Let's put it that way. But when it went the same way with him, and he heard unheardly a lot than foreign nations, I do suppose, and he was off one fine morning just the same as the girl. Why he went and what he had done was our question for as much as a year after, for he never took his urdy-gurdy, and there it lays on the shelf. But whatever an urdy-gurdy is, he left it behind. Never leave your urdy-gurdy behind. That's very suspicious if you leave your urdy-gurdy behind. And the remainder of the evening Stephen spent in miscellaneous cross-examination of Mrs. Bunch and efforts to extract a tune from the urdy-gurdy. In the night he had a curious dream, and at the end of a passage on the top of the house in which his bedroom was situated, there was an old disused bathroom, and it was kept locked, and at the top half of the door was glazed, and since the muslin curtains had been used to hang there, had long been gone. you could look in and see a lead-lined bath affixed with a wall on the right hand and a head towards the window. And in one night which I am speaking, Stephen Elliott found himself, as he thought, looking through the glazed door. The moon was shining through the window, and he was a glazed figure, and he gazed at a figure which lay in the bath. His description of what he had saw reminds me of which I had once beheld myself in the famous vaults of St. Michael's Church in Dublin, which possessed the horrid property of preserving corpses for decay for centuries. A figure inexpressibly thin and pathetic, a dusty laden coffin enveloped it in a shroud-like garment, and thin lips crooked into a faint, dreadful smile, and hands crossed tightly across the region of the heart. I looked upon it, and a distant, almost inaudible moan seemed to issue from its lips, and the arms began to stir, and the terror from the sight forced Stephen backwards, and as he awoke to the fact that he was indeed standing on the cold boarded floor in the passage of the hall, on the passage in the full light of the moon, with courage which I did not think that he can be common among boys of that age, he went to the door of the bathroom to ascertain in the fringe of his dream were really there, and it was not, and he went back to bed. Mrs. Bunch was much more impressed the next morning by the story, and he went as far as to replace the muslin curtain over the glazed door in the bathroom. Mrs. Abney, moreover, to whom he confided his experiences at breakfast, was greatly interested, and made notes of the matter, in which he called his book. And the spring equinox was approaching, and Mr. Abney frequently reminded his cousin, adding that these things had been always considered by the ancients to be critical time for the young, that Stephen would do well to take care of himself and to shut his bedroom door at night, and that the centrist had been valuable remarks on the subject, and two incidences that had occurred about him the time that made impressions upon Stephen's mind. The first was an unusual, uneasy, oppressed night which had passed through, that he could not recall any peculiar dream which he had had. The following evening Mrs. Bunch had occupied him in mending his nightgown. "Gracious me, Master Stephen," she broke forth rather irritably, "how do you manage to tear your nightgowns all to flinders this way? It was Freddy Krueger that did it. Look here, sir, what trouble do you have to give poor servants when you have to darn and mend after you?" And there was indeed the most destructive and apparently wanton series of slits and scores in his garment, which was undoubtedly required a skillful needle to make much good. And there confided to the left side of his chest a long parallel slit, about 6 inches long, about 6 inches in length, some of them quite piercing in texture of the linen. Stephen, the only one, expressed his entire ignorance of the origin. He was sure that they were not there the night before. But, he said, Mrs. Bunch, they were just the same as the scratches on the outside of the bedroom door, and I am sure never had been anything to that. I am sure that I had nothing, that I have never had anything to do with making them. Mrs. Bunch gazed at him open-mouthed and snatched up a candle and departed hastily from the room, and was making her way upstairs. In a few minutes she came down. Well, she said, Master Stephen, it's a funny thing to me now, how them marks and scratches come here too high, far up for a cat or dog are made 'em, and much less a rat, for all the world like a chairman's fingernails, as my uncle in the tea trade used to tell me. As for us, or when was a girls together, I wouldn't say anything to Master, not if I was to you. Master Stephen, my dear, I just turn the key to the door, and then you go to your bed. I always do, Mrs. Bunch, as soon as I say my prayers. And that's a good child. Always say your prayers, and no one can hurt you. Therewith, Mrs. Bunch dressed herself in the mending the injured nightgown in the intervals of the meditation until bedtime. This was on Friday night, March of 1812. And the following evening, the unusual duet of Stephen and Mrs. Bunch were augmented by the sudden arrival of Mr. Parks, the butler, who was a rule kept himself rather to himself in his own pantry, and he did not see that Stephen was there, and he was moreover frustrated and less slow of speech than was his vaunt. Master may get up his own vine and his likes in the evening, was the first remark. Either I do it in the daytime or not at all, Mrs. Bunch. I don't know what I may be very like. Is it rats or the wind going into the cellars? But I am not like a young man as I was, and I can't go through with it as I have done. Well, Mr. Parks, you know it is a surprising place for the rats is this hall. I am not denying that, Mrs. Bunch, and to be sure, many times that I've heard the tale from the men of the shipyard, from the rat that could speak. I never laid down my confidence in that in front of me. But tonight, if I had dreamed myself to lay my ear to the floor of the further bin, I could pretty much have heard what they were saying. Oh, there, Mr. Parks, I have no patience with your fantasies. Rats talking in the vine cellar, indeed. Well, Mrs. Bunch, I have no wish to argue with you. All I say is, if you choose to go to the far bend, I lay my ear to the door, that you may prove my words this minute. What nonsense do you talk, Mr. Parks? Not fit for this child to listen to. Why you'll frighten Master Stephen there out of his wits. What, Master Stephen, said Mr. Parks, awakening from his consciousness. The boy's presence. Master Stephen knows well enough when I am playing a joke with you, Mrs. Bunch. See how many pages left. Okay, just a couple more. All right. In fact, Master Stephen knew much too well to surprise that Mr. Parks had been the first instance intended of a joke. He was interested, not altogether pleasant, in the situation, but all his questions were unsuccessful in including the butler to give a more undetailed account of the experiences in the wine cellar. We have arrived at March 24th, 1812, and it was a day of curious experiences for Stephen, a windy, noisy day, which filled the house and the garden, which was a restless impression. As Stephen stood by the fence of the grounds, he looked about in the dark, and he felt an endless procession of unseen people, and were sweeping past him in the wind, and borne in relentless and aimless, vainly striving to step seamlessly to catch at something that might arrest the flight and bring them once again into contact with the living world, which had formed a part. After luncheon that day, Abney said, "Again, my boy, do you think you could manage to come to me tonight as late as 11 o'clock by my study? I have to be busy until that time, and I wish to show you something connected with your future time, which is that important that you should know. You are not to mention this matter, Mrs. Bunch, nor to anyone else in the house, that you have better go to your room at the usual time. Here is a new excitement added to your life." Stephen eagerly grasped at the opportunity of sitting up until 11 o'clock. He looked into the library door, and on his way upstairs that evening he saw a brazier, which had been often noticed in the corner of the room and moved out before the fire, and an old silver gilt cup stood on the table, filled with red wine. I don't drink wine. You know how it goes. Some written sheets of paper lay near it. Mrs. Abney had was sprinkling some incense on the brazier, and the round silver box where Stephen passed had not seemed to notice his step. My hair in my face here. And the wind had fallen, and there was still night and the full moon. Full moon. At about 10 o'clock, Stephen was standing in the night, standing at the open window in his bedroom, and looked in and out of every corner, still as the night was, mysterious population in the distant moonlight. Woods was not yet lulled to rest. From time to time, strange cries from the lost and despairing wanderers surrounded from across the mere. There might be notes of owls and waterbirds, and there did not quite resemble either sound. And they're coming from a corner. Now they sounded from nearer the other side of the water. In a few moments they seemed to be floating about among the shrubberies. Then they ceased. But just as Stephen was thinking about the shuttering of the windows and reassuming a reading of Robinson Crusoe, he caught sight of two figures standing in the graveled terrace that ran alongside the garden side of the wall, the figure of a boy and a girl, and it seemed that they had been side by side looking up at the windows. Something in the form of the girl recalled irresistibly his dream of the figure in the bath. Uh-oh. The boy inspired him with more acute fear, whilst the girl stood there, half smiling, with eyes clasped over her heart. With her hands clasped over her heart. The boy's thin-shaped black hair, ragged clothing, raised his arms in the air and peered of menace and unstoppable hunger and longing. The moon shone over his almost transparent hands. Stephen saw that the nails were fearfully long, and that night shone, and that the light shone through them. And as he stood with his arms thus raised, his disclosure of terrifying spectacle, on the side of his chest there opened a black gaping rent, and then fell upon Stephen's brain rather than upon his open ear impressions of one of the hungry, desolate cries which he had heard resounding from the woods of Aswarby. And all that evening, in another moment, a dreadful pair had appeared swiftly and noiselessly over the dry gravel, and he heard them no more. Inexpressibly frightened, he determined to take his candle to go down to Mrs. Abney's study for an hour appointed for the meeting was near at hand. The study of the library, out of the front half of one side, Stephen, urged on by terror, he did not take on getting there. To the effect of an entrance was not so easy. It was locked, and he felt sure, for the key was on the outside of the door as usual, and he repeated knocks and pronounced no answer. Mrs. Abney was engaged. He was speaking. Why did they try to cry out? Why was the cry choked in his throat? Why he too see the mysterious children. But now everything was quiet, and the door yielded, and Stephen's terrified, frantic pushing. And on the table, Mrs. Abney's study, certain papers were found which explained the situation to Stephen Elliott, which was too old to understand them. The most important sentence was as follows. It was the belief, very strongly, greatly held by ancients, of whose wisdom in these matters I have experienced, as induces me to place confidence in the assertions that enacting certain processes to which the moderns have sometimes of barbaric complexes, very remarkable enlightenment of spiritual faculties in man to be attained, that, for example, by absorbing the personalities of certain numbers of his fellow creatures, an individual may gain complete accessibility over those orders of spiritual belongings which controlled the elements and forces of our universe. Yes. It is recorded of Simon Magus that he was able to fly in the air, to become invisible, or to assume any form he pleased, by the agency of the soul of the boy whom used the libellous phrase employed by the author of Clemente Recognitus. He had murdered. I find it and set it down, moreover, with a considerable detail, writing of Hermes Trismegistus. Oh, vampire can't read Latin anymore. It's a dead language, like me. And that similar happy results may be pronounced upon the absorption of the hearts, no less than the human belongs to the age of the 21 years. To the testing of the truth of the receipt had been devoted to a greater part of the last years of selecting the corpora vila, or the experimentation of such persons which could covertly be removed without the occasion of sensible gap of society. The first step I effected by the removal of Phoebe Stanley, a girl of gypsy extraction, on March 24th, 1792. The second by the removal of a wandering Italian lad named Giovanni Paoli, and the night of March 23rd, 1805, and the final victim to employ a word of repugnant in the highest degree to my feelings must be my cousin, Stephen Elliott. By this day be thus March 24th, 1812. Uh-oh. Stephen's in some deep kimchi. And the best means effect by requiring absorption is to remove the heart from the living subject, to reduce it to ashes, and to mingle them with about a pint of some red wine, preferably port. And that remains in the first two subjects at least. It will be well to conceal and disguise both, conceal a disguised bathroom for a wine cellar, and will be found convenient for such a purpose. Some annoyance may be experienced from the psychic portion of the subject, which popular language signifies the name of the ghosts by the name of the philosophic temperament to whom alone experiment is appropriate, will be little prone to attack importance of the feeble effort to whom being a wreak in vengeance on him. I contemplate with the liveliest satisfaction the enlargement of the emancipated existence of the experiment, if successful, will confer on me not only a place placing me beyond the reach of human justice, so-called, but eliminating a great excitement and perspective of death itself. Oh boy, quite a story. Oh, Mr. James, you know how to write good book. I like that story. Sorry, old vampire stumbled over some words. Dyslexia is a bugger. It vexes vampires too. So anyway, I won't take up any more of your time. Thank you very much. We see you next week for another Friday Night Frights and stuff like that. Be safe. Be kind to everyone. Be kind to your puppies and your kitties. Bye-bye.